Good morning to everyone, and today we are going to analyze the role of non-profit. Again, we are in the part of the course which is considering how to manage the public service organization constituencies. So, now I hope it is clear to you we have this shift from government to governance. The governance paradigm is more inclusive. So it needs the participation of the other stakeholders, not simply top-down policy making and policy implementation, but participation of other stakeholders. Traditionally, the stakeholder analysis in public sector did not consider enough the role of non-profit. Nowadays, so in 2006, it wouldn't make any sense to make a stakeholder analysis, to conduce a stakeholder analysis for public sector, but also for you, for private sector, not considering the role of non-profit. Because non-profit nowadays is a major actor in the social and in the economic arena. So, after assessing how to involve citizens, right, citizen relationship management, and after considering how to manage the relations between business and government, so last lecture dealt with business-government relations, today we are considering this third very important stakeholder, which is non-profit. Now, when we talk about non-governmental organizations, what we mean by NGOs, non-governmental organizations. But first of all, let's consider what we don't mean, so what NGOs are not. NGOs are not governmental agencies and are not businesses. Particularly, one common error is considering NGOs businesses that have been set up to make a profit but which did not succeed. So they were turned into NGOs. This is absolutely non-correct. So NGOs are not business firms, are not governments, and are not, in our meaning, in our definition, temporary organization. So if 10 of you guys would set up an organization, a temporary organization of 5004 students, we wouldn't consider it an NGO, a non-governmental organization. Why? Because it wouldn't be stable, it wouldn't have an organizational structure behind it. So we tend to consider one of the features of NGOs is definitely to have a stable organizational structure which is intended to last in the long run. So, now moving more into what NGOs are, typically we are talking about private organizations, so they do not have the feature of being public, so no public ownership. So private entities which are not controlled by private sector, so businesses, or by government. So they tend to be rather autonomous. If we look at the civil society, NGOs are out there and they really perform an autonomous, independent, rather neutral role. Also, typically they are set up to produce the public good or public services, otherwise they would be simply businesses, right? So they are private in terms of ownership, not owned by businesses, not owned by the public sector. However, they are typically set up to serve citizens, to serve individual needs, typically to perform a public service. So we are definitely in the public interest sphere, but not through governmental agencies. And this is also tend to include the action of volunteers. So one of the main assets of NGOs is definitely the inclusion of volunteers. So volunteers share the same mission of the NGO they work for, and they tend to provide this first-hand support, which typically is one of the major assets of NGOs. And also, from a legal point of view, in most countries they are subject to distribution constraints, okay? So, if an NGO has profits, those profits should not be distributed or redistributed among the so-called shareholders. So in the private sector, you have profits, you redistribute them among shareholders. You can't do it, not even indirectly, in NGOs. And again, the last feature is that they are organized through a stable structure. So they are intended to last in the long run. So practically, they have a mission. They have clear goals. They have temporary meetings, periodic meetings. They have a board. They can have an assembly. So they have stable entities which overlook what NGOs do, which control, which monitor what NGOs do, which set the yearly goals, and thereby we consider them a stable organization. Now, maybe you recall the reading of Mintzberg, Managing Government, Governing Management. Okay, that one, that reading, really it's important for considering which is the role of NGOs, because maybe remember that Mintzberg in that reading was suggesting to move beyond the traditional dichotomy between public sector and private sector, between government and business, and he was suggesting, hey, look, the economic arena is populated, is crowded by what? By sectors in between. You have the cooperatives, you have NGOs. So here we are, in the sectors in between. This is why, rather than considering the public sector and the private sector, this is rather a continuum between public and private, and you have a number of nuances. So you can have non-profit organizations whose mission, if you look closer, the mission is it really resembles public organizations, or rather you can have foundations like the Gates Foundation, where, as you may imagine, the mission is public interest, public sphere. However, there is a sense of belonging to the business environment, right? Because they are business foundations. So since we have so many nuances, it's useless to cut up the sector, the system between public and private, and rather consider this continuum which has at the two extremes businesses and non-profit associations, but then a number of organizational structures in between. For example, we have the so-called public interest NGOs, so NGOs which are mainly addressing public interests, such as associations, volunteers associations, and foundations. And then we have NGOs which are giving a mutual interest, which are serving a mutual interest. For example, in the case of unions and in the case of the cooperatives. In this case, really, rather than talking about a generic public interest, we are talking about a mutual interest between the very organizational structure and the members that participate to that NGO. And then we move and we have social enterprises and cooperatives. Finally, we have businesses which in their very mission perform socially responsible goals and strategies, so businesses which are very keen on corporate social responsibility strategies and measures. And finally, we have the traditional businesses. So as you see, the realm of non-profit organization, non-governmental organization is really fragmented, and there are a number of different organizations.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What's the difference between social cooperatives and cooperatives in general?
Okay, if you take the case of newspapers, for example, so the question here is the main difference between social cooperatives, so-called, and cooperatives. If we want to accept the distinction between social co-ops and co-ops, an example would be a co-op, non-social cooperative, but simply cooperative, would be a newspaper whose ownership, so employees of that newspaper, like journalists and generic employees, own the newspaper. This is rather common also in the UK, so it would be collective ownership. While you have social cooperatives, for example, for healthcare services provision, where the very service is a social service. So as a member of the social cooperative, you also want to make sure you will be able to participate and to use the services of this cooperative. The service being social and healthcare service. Yes, if we are considering an example of a socially responsible firm, this would be a firm that in its very mission includes public good or public sphere interest. Let's make an example, and maybe we want to disagree on the achievement of those socially responsible firms. However, looking at the simple mission, the Body Shop, okay? The Body Shop main mission when it was founded, so the founder of the Body Shop wanted to include goods and products or raw materials that were respective of the environment. So in terms of the very mission of the Body Shop, it was including environmental concerns in the production and marketing of its products, okay? Now, let's consider two of the main common types of NGOs. We have associations and foundations. Let's start with associations. So typically, on the basis of their legal form, we tend to consider association when their aim is absolutely not the redistribution of profit. So associations cannot redistribute their profit among members, and typically they pursue an idealistic mission. So the idea of establishing an association and not a business is that even if you have profits, you cannot redistribute among the members, plus you are pursuing an idealistic idea, an idealistic mission. And second, there is a very important aspect, which is the personal aspect. So members of an association are expected to share the same values, and they really want to achieve the same goal by being a member, so by participating as members to that association. Last, the agreement on which basis the association is set can be formalized in a legal contract. So you might have a legal contract at the basis of an association, but the assembly, so when you have in an association the assembly, the voting structure is always one head, one vote. Okay? So let's say that from a democratic perspective, associations are very representative of their members. So one head, one vote, personal interest, no redistribution of profits, and let's say sharing common values. So if we look at the common organizational structure of one association, you have the assembly and you have the administrators. Typically, the founders are part of the assembly, if they are still alive, naturally, and they are in charge of the long-term mission, but also of the income statement approval, and they also must appoint the administrators. So the assembly typically performs those goals, setting the long-term goals or the vision and the mission of the association, approving the income statement, plus appointing the administrators. While the administrators in general are in charge of performing the daily managerial activities of a non-profit, so taking short-term decisions daily, representing the association, and in many cases also performing the fundraising activities. Let's move to the second type of non-profit, which is the foundation. So when we focus on foundation, typically foundations are meant to give a specific destination to a private fund. If we take as example the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Soros Foundation, maybe you are familiar with these kinds of foundations where really we have a fund, a substantial fund, and the foundation is created in order to give a destination to a private fund. So while in the association the personal element is the one that prevails, in the foundation the patrimonial element is the one that prevails, okay? Also, you have an act of incorporations in which the vision of the founder is included. So let's say that rather than having a contract, like in the case of an association, you have this act of incorporation where the mission, the vision, of the founder is included. So the vision of the founder is included in the mission of the foundation. And again, the foundation is based on a substantial patrimonial element, and the founders of the foundation want to appropriate that patrimonial element and want to destinate this private fund to a certain issue or to a set of issues, such as in the case of the Gates Foundation. So in this case we have, let's say, a couple of main priorities. One being fighting HIV/AIDS mainly by scientific research and by investing on vaccine, right? Investing on the research and development needed to come out with a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. And if we go on the website of the Melissa Gates Foundation, you will find that the vision of the founders is incorporated in the mission of the foundation. So you see, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, about us, and you would have the main vision of the founders, which then, so you have our values, and those values de facto are incorporating the vision of the founders. So far so good? Okay. Now let's move to the third type of NGOs that we are going to consider, which is unions and co-ops, also called mutually beneficial NGOs. Again, in this case we are considering NGOs which are characterized by mutual interest. So you want to become member of a union, for example, because you are also not only seeking a public interest, but also this is an instrumental view. So you are participating for mutual benefits, And in the case of cooperatives, like you also have cooperatives, co-op for retailing. So in Europe, co-ops are one of the most likely, most common forms of retailers for commodities, right? And in those retailers, you do have profit redistribution, however, you set up ceilings. So in this case, until a certain threshold, profits are redistributed among shareholders, while after a certain ceiling, the profits will be reinvested to reinforce the mission. For example, by investing in research and development, by investing in programs for the community, so community programs, community initiatives, okay? By investing in the territory, by providing infrastructures for the territory, for the local community, and so on and so forth. So, until a certain threshold, we have a mutual benefit. After a certain threshold, we have a public interest investment, so an investment done mainly for the community or the national level where the co-op is operating. And also in the cooperatives, so whichever the kind, social or straight cooperatives, you typically have one head, one vote criterion, which is also a specificity of NGOs. Now, let's consider some of the theories behind the existence of non-governmental organizations. So, why do NGOs exist, in your opinion? So, forget the slide. Why do NGOs exist? Exactly. For public goods theory, let's say that so NGOs would provide public goods, and if we consider the public goods theory, maybe no one but government is able and has the incentive to provide certain goods. So non-profits and non-governmental organizations exist because they are performing and they are providing services which businesses do not have incentive in providing. However, maybe they are much more flexible than government. So why NGOs exist according to the public goods theory? Because businesses don't have the incentive to provide the same kind of services or goods, and government in that case hasn't been proven to be extremely efficient and or effective in providing that good or that service. Thereby, NGOs are the right actor, the right player in charge of providing this set of services. But also, we have the contract failure theory. There are services, there are sectors in which the exchange between customer and businesses is not very effective. Typically, those services in which it is extremely difficult to assess the quality of the service. The services where, like, the human touch, for example, so-called, is very important, is a component of those services. And in those cases, NGOs prove to be more effective than private businesses. Why? Because typically this is a one-shot only exchange, and typically the quality is difficult to assess. Plus, we have another set of theory which is rather important, according to which the non-distribution constraint is a limit to opportunistic behavior. So in some economic realms in which you want to make sure that participants do not operate simply according to an opportunistic behavior, the best way to ensure, so to select the participants, to self-select the participants, is imposing this non-redistribution constraint. if it's operating in a very individualistic approach, and they want to make sure that in that specific realm, for example, social services, I only have people, I only have actors that operate in a non-opportunistic behavior or perspective, how can I restrict, how can I make sure that the participants are non-opportunistic in their behaviors? By imposing the constraint of non-redistribution. He will participate only if he agrees in non-redistributing the profit. So basically, if it is acting in a non-opportunistic way, with a non-opportunistic behavior. And finally, according to the most instrumental of all the theories of why NGOs exist, according to this theory, basically NGOs exist because of financial and tax benefits. So since in many countries, if you have an NGO, you have some tax advantages. Since NGOs enjoy those tax advantages, you will have people working for NGOs and establishing NGOs mainly because they can enjoy those financial benefits in terms of tax benefits. Okay? So those are the main theories which range from public good, public perspective, public sphere, towards very opportunistic behavior in terms of tax benefits. Now, let's consider some of the main activities that NGOs perform. So, certainly one of the main activities that NGOs perform is advocacy. So, advocacy might also be labeled as raising awareness. You want to raise awareness, and I've been mentioning it briefly already. You want to raise awareness about a societal problem, okay? So you want to make sure that you are building social will to fight this social problem, to eliminate this social problem. For example, in the case of Millennium Development Goals, to eradicate extreme poverty, okay? So you are building this social will through your advocacy activities. It is unlikely that governments alone, or businesses even less, will work for advocacy, right? Will advocate a societal problem or a societal phenomenon. Typically, the organizations that work with advocacy are voluntary organizations. Typically, they are, from a legal point of view, associations, so not foundations but associations, and typically they don't deliver service, but their very mission is to raise awareness about a specific social problem. Think about Greenpeace, okay? Greenpeace is an association, indeed is an NGO, is not a foundation, and does Greenpeace deliver services, concrete services? Not really. So which is the main aim of Greenpeace? Advocacy. Advocacy addressing mostly social will, so awareness of environmental problems, awareness of environmental concerns, okay? But in some cases they are also trying to change the individual behavior. For example, there has been a major campaign on Greenpeace addressing the recycling habits. So in this case, the campaign was aimed at changing individual behavior, not simply social will. And then you have redistribution and financing. For example, the activities of the Soros Foundation. In this case, you have they work in humanitarian activities, but mainly through grants. So, Soros Foundation, Rockefeller and Gates all work mainly through grants. Those grants are for individuals. Those grants are for scientific organizations, so for research and development, and typically for scientists then, and scientific research. And those grants sometimes, but not often, are for government or better governmental activities. But in most cases, the funds of those foundations, so humanitarian and redistribution activities performed by foundations, are addressing individuals, for example, in needing countries, in countries where they wouldn't have the chance of study, for example, of getting an education, a secondary education, and or they are addressing research centers to perform a specific scientific activity. And they are based on merits, so merit goods, and which can be the risk in both cases, advocacy and foundation, so redistribution or humanitarian activities. In both cases, according to some scholars, one of the risks that NGOs run is the risk of overproduction. Why? Because maybe if you have a price linked to a specific service, to a specific activity, you are able to quantify which is the ideal demand for that good or that service, okay? So when the demand meets the supply at that specific price and you get the equilibrium, that means that the quantity which is supplied is the right one, or is the one that your potential customers are willing to bear. When we are talking about free services such as advocacy, such as humanitarian on redistribution efforts and activities, it is more difficult to be able to establish exactly which is the right quantity. So according to some scholars, I want at least to mention this point, non-governmental organizations lack efficiency because they are not able to find a proxy of price for determining the right quantity, the right amount of services they should provide. So this has been considered traditionally a limitation of NGOs. And then you have the direct production of public services, such as the Salvation Army or the Red Cross, for example. And in this case, the NGO is providing directly a service, and to some extent it is acting on behalf of the state or is substituting the state. So typically businesses are considered to satisfy indirectly human needs by producing wealth, and this wealth can then be used to satisfy the basic or sophisticated human needs. In the case of the so-called merit goods, we are talking about producing services which are not produced by businesses and are not even produced by governments. Why? Maybe because the governments in developing countries do not have institutional or economic capacity. So even though they had the intent of delivering those services, they are not able to do it. In other cases, maybe governments are providing very standardized services or goods, and governments did not yet recognize that that specific social category or that specific group of people need a new service. And which is the competitive, let's say, advantage of NGOs? That particularly the grassroots organization, those that work in the field. They are close to people, right? So being close to people, they can recognize the need as soon as the need emerges, and they tend to be much more flexible than government, because again, governments worldwide typically need to ensure neutrality but also standardization. So neutrality comes with a certain level of standardization. Thereby, you tend to be less customized in providing your services than NGOs. Is there a question?
Yeah. Okay, regarding like funds,
Okay, so let's answer your colleague question. Your colleague question is about advocacy NGOs, so we are not talking about redistribution activities, we are not talking about direct production of public services, we are talking about advocacy. There are NGOs whose work, whose main mission is borderline really, in the sense that they not necessarily operate under the instructions or directions of government. That is often the case for Greenpeace, the NGO I've been mentioning. So, your colleague asked, where does Greenpeace get the money from? Now, Greenpeace typically raises funds through individual donations. So, the many NGOs that work in the advocacy, so whose main mission is to advocate and not delivering services, so they are not working on behalf of states, they raise money from individuals. There are different strategies to raise funds. There is the annual campaign, and then there is a fundraising which is trying to raise funds for a specific campaign or a specific initiative, maybe linked to an event. So they use a lot also event organization for raising funds. We will see in a moment a couple of strategies, common strategies to raise funds. However, in the case of Greenpeace, in the case of Friend of the Earth, which is another, in this case UK-based and US-based organization, NGO, working with environmental concerns, also in this case the main donors are individuals. Okay? So, which are, in terms of management, we are in a public management course, we are considering one of the main stakeholders of government, but which is also a very important stakeholder for businesses, non-profit. So, which are, let's say, the managerial challenges for non-profit or NGO organizations? Typically, they are service organizations. So, first of all the managerial challenges that managers working in private service organizations have to face, also NGOs have to face typically the same challenges. For example, quality of service is much more difficult to be measured than the quality of a product, of a good, okay? Particularly when we are talking about advocacy. So as you may imagine, it is rather difficult to set up indicators for measuring the quality of a campaign. So how do you measure also the effectiveness of a campaign? Now there is a rising number of studies dealing with the issue of measurement, so how to measure advocacy campaigns. The product cannot be stored, typically in the case of particularly in the case of advocacy, but also in the case of services to individuals. So, if you are the Red Cross or Salvation Army, certainly there are products you can store, there are goods you can store for emergency, for example, but in terms of service, if you have a specific slot of voluntary work available, either you use it now or you cannot store the voluntary work for the next decade, right? So it is extremely difficult to store the availability of media attention, to store the availability of voluntary work. And also those services are personality intensive, so-called. So they really ask for a personal contribution, and they are linked to how you launch and how you establish your brand. To some extent, the brand building and the brand marketing efforts that businesses do are similar to those that NGOs have to perform in order to establish their brand, to differentiate their brand from other competitors in the same, let's say, NGO arena, and then to maintain the brand. Particularly when we are talking about fundraising, and we all know that there are competing NGOs in fundraising sense, because a number of NGOs compete each year, for example, for the annual endowment campaign, when they have to raise funds typically before Christmas, all compete in the same period of time for potential funders. And it is important also to consider, particularly when we are talking about voluntary contribution and the work of volunteers. If you read the case of Sidelines, it is evident that the contribution of volunteers is crucial for many non-profit organizations. When you rely on the contribution of volunteers, do you think that it's easy to impose a certain managerial style, to impose a certain timetable, a certain schedule, to impose a certain level of coordination? No, it is extremely difficult. So the ability of non-profit organization, non-governmental organization is really based on the professional and individual ability of the NGO manager. So vis-a-vis NGO managers have to perform also this charismatic managerial style. Why? Because they are addressing volunteers in many cases, and volunteers are not subjected to, for example, professional threats, career paths, right, or financial incentives. So you really have to motivate your workforce with tools, with managerial tools, which are completely unconventional compared to the business managerial tools.
Excuse me, I'm not clear with the notion that defines the product.
Okay, so when we consider sometimes to eradicate extreme poverty, so the main mission, let's say, of an NGO is eradicate extreme poverty, you don't even have exactly clear which is your potential consumer. It is extremely difficult to adopt the same perspective, the same mindset of the private sector, because you are addressing potentially the entire population, the entire world population. So you tend to focus your activities on what? On tools to eradicate extreme poverty, and less on the final consumer or the final users, okay? So basically, if you consider the activity eradicate extreme poverty, what you can do is to focus on which are the main problems that stem from extreme poverty. For example, child mortality rate. Okay, let's see which are the possible indicators for reducing child mortality rate, and let's try, if you are working in the advocacy field, let's try to raise awareness of the rate of child mortality, how to decrease child mortality, what developed countries can do to reduce child mortality. So really, the indicators again become extremely difficult, and your activities are potentially addressing the entire world population. So there is something that I wanted to mention. Okay, according to your question, it would be extremely difficult to market to the final stakeholders and to market, so to the final users, and to market to, let's say, developed world donors. Let's say I work for Oxfam and I am in charge of marketing, but marketing what? So I have rural marketing, for example. I want to make sure that rural women that live in rural areas in developing countries use breastfeeding rather than powder milk feeding because it's safer. Why? Because the quality of water is so dangerous that you want to support breastfeeding rather than powder milk feeding, which needs water. Okay? Let's say that's one main marketing strategy. I have to develop marketing tools to talk with rural communities to rural areas, to women living in rural areas. And as you may imagine, the set of marketing tools you have to develop is really customized to that specific area, so it's locally based. At the same time, you have to market to developed countries what? You have to raise awareness even in developed countries that this is an issue. Why? Because maybe there are brands which are marketing powdered milk, and you want to make sure that consumers in developed countries are aware that the brand they are buying from is marketing powdered milk in developing countries. And I'm making this extremely concrete example of the activities that Child Milk Action or Oxfam are performing. Okay? So you are marketing both to rural communities, in some cases to the very final users, and to other, let's say, stakeholders or opinion makers that in the developed world should be aware of what's going on in the developing countries. So it is extremely difficult in terms of managerial challenges also to continuously address efforts aimed at promoting your cause, raising awareness in rural areas, for example, or in economically developing countries and in developed countries. Plus, you want to, let's say you are an NGO which works only in Germany and it works only with people which are unemployed. You typically at least have two targets of your marketing activities. You have the unemployed, and you have to search for marketing channels and marketing tools which are non-conventional, because maybe they don't read the newspaper every day, they are not connected online, and they visit your website. So you have to find, for example, community channels or work with the social services or with the local government agencies to market and to promote your service for the very final users you are trying to serve. Plus, you are using traditional, conventional fundraising techniques or tools to get funds and to raise awareness among the social categories which are connected, which read the newspapers, which are online, and will watch news. Okay? So, at least, even if you work in developed countries, you always have a double marketing standard for your very final users and for the rest of the population, particularly when you both want to raise awareness and help out specific social categories. Okay, so far so good? Okay, in terms of let's stay for a moment on the typical managerial problem. So double marketing plan, importance of integrated communication, because when you want to raise awareness and you want to raise funds, you always have to give the same message. So people in the fundraising department or in the fundraising unit and people in the strategy unit have to work together. Plus, typically there is a high turnover. When you rely on volunteer contribution, on volunteer work, it's likely that your turnover in your staff will be higher than in regular business organizations. Why? Because maybe you are a student and you can volunteer and then you start working and you don't have any more time. Or typically, whichever is an external event that prevents you from doing something, you tend to quit, first of all, your voluntary work, right? Your work as volunteer. So, volunteer associations face a higher turnover than business organizations. And this also implies that you, for example, must define an instruction manual which is extremely clear, because it's likely that you will have people coming in and coming out very often, so that they can be easily tuned on what they have to do. For example, many NGOs set some entry barriers, which are represented by training, so that they make sure that the employees, in this case voluntary employees, are really willing to contribute, because typically when you have as an entry barrier a training course, a training module, let's say 1 month training, you will really start working for the NGO as a volunteer and go through the training if you are deeply motivated. So this can be also a way to self-select the employees, voluntary employees that are more motivated, and that will be less subject to turnover. Just imagine, if you were to work in a non-profit organization in an NGO, for example, working with homeless, let's say you had a 3 weeks training, which is rather common, as an entry barrier. Either you do it or you can't help out. If you are motivated, it's likely that you go through the training, but then you remain loyal to the organization. You tend to work for the organization, and it's likely that you won't quit the organization the very first time that you have a problem or that you are busy. While if the entry barriers are minimal or do not exist, the turnover will tend to be extremely high. So one strategy that is used is also self-selection of volunteers through training module. Do you have what?
Having high entry barriers, you know, because you lose a lot of people that would like to help when they have time.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and thank you for this question, because the very case of silence, so your colleague was asking actually to put barriers to volunteer contribution in terms of work, so volunteer workforce can be positive because you select those that are more highly motivated, but also negative because you lose what? Workforce when is available. So one of the main problems that volunteer organizations are facing is really the so-called revolving door volunteering. So how to accept volunteers that will stay there for a limited amount of time when they have time, and how to make profit, how to benefit from this contribution even though this is unlikely to be long-term contribution. Now, the internet at the moment is one of the best ways to ensure that volunteers can enjoy some level of flexibility. This is why I suggest you the reading on Sidelines, because for the first time Sidelines, that has been the first non-profit in the US that used the internet and online for accepting virtual volunteering, which basically leaves open the door for those volunteers that cannot commit to specific time or specific schedule and want to contribute, but only when they have time and when they are free. So there are a number of possible activities that volunteers can perform also online. Naturally, not all non-profit or non-governmental organizations can rely on internet volunteering or virtual volunteering. It depends from the mission. But imagine when we are talking about assistance to women with high-risk pregnancy, which is the mission of Sidelines. In that case, the woman can benefit from the assistance of other women who experience the same problems through the telephone or online. So you get your woman as a volunteer, you are interested in doing it, you are matched with another woman anywhere in the United States, which possibly is experiencing the same problems that you had already, and then you can communicate online or via telephone whenever is more convenient to you and to the woman you are assisting. So this has been a very good example of trying to use innovative systems to benefit from volunteering. How? By making it more flexible, thereby not losing out possible help and support from so-called revolving door volunteers. Is it clear for everyone? Good. And another problem in terms of managerial challenges is also the so-called double balance in wages. When you are paying part of your personnel, so you have part of the personnel which is paid and part of the personnel which is volunteer. So typically this has been a solution, deciding to pay part of the personnel, for example the personnel which is 100% so full-time working for your organization, and leaving for volunteers all the activities which can be performed in part-time, with part-time contribution. But typically most NGOs which do have a stable structure need at least a minimal staff which is fixed, which is stable, and typically you must also pay the staff. Please? Okay. As you may imagine, in order to run a non-profit association, you must exert a strong role in leadership too. Okay, so charismatic leadership in terms of leadership style and managerial style is often associated with volunteer organization management. Why? Because you have to motivate, and again you cannot use the typical human resources threats such as career paths or financial incentives, right? Or bonuses, because it's unlikely that you will have enough resources available to award your employees in a financial way. So, when we talk about fundraising, I've been mentioning that fundraising is one of the main ways in which non-governmental organizations pool resources which are needed to serve their users, the final users, and or to advocate for a certain societal phenomenon, a certain societal problem. So, which are the main problems and the main strategies associated with fundraising? First of all, you should define the means you are going to use. Many non-profit, non-governmental organizations use really word of mouth. So, word of mouth is very important, particularly when your mission is raising awareness and not simply delivering a service. But why word of mouth is also important when you are delivering a service, for example, to societal categories which are non-connected? It is banal. So, why are you using word of mouth? Because maybe, good, because maybe those categories not being connected won't be access to traditional media, right? If you are, again, in an NGO working with homelesses, how can you spread the new service, the awareness of a new service which is being delivered from your NGO? Mainly through word of mouth, okay? So particularly when you're working at the community level or you're working for targets which are non-connected and which do not use the traditional media, you will use word of mouth as main channel. Plus you have mass media and direct mail. Direct mail is also used for fundraising. Did you ever receive a direct mail, let's say from UNICEF? Okay, some of you did. So direct mailing for fundraising is rather typical, and it's a way to raise funds both for the annual endowment campaign and when you are collecting funds for a specific project or a specific emergency, as in the case of UNICEF. So you have to define your targets and define the benefits you are offering to those targets. The Metropolitan Museum in New York is also a good example of fundraising, is a good practice in fundraising for NGOs, because the museum really segmented its possible donors in different categories, in different targets, and then addressed for each target which could be, let's say, the expected level of donation we can ask from this specific target. Let's say 50 students, $50 per year. Which are the benefits we are ensuring to the students that are becoming members of the Metropolitan Museum? Free entrance, or maybe the annual Metropolitan party or annual Metropolitan event. Then corporations, which is the amount we can ask from this target, which are the benefits? Okay, maybe they can use our rooms for their corporate events, right? They have to organize their annual corporate meeting, and they might be used to hold the meeting in our rooms, for example, from 9 p.m. on. And the Metropolitan has been really successful in segmenting the possible targets of donors, in assessing which is the contribution they can offer and which are the benefits that they can get from their Metropolitan membership. Okay, so that's also an interesting example of definition of targets, definition of benefits for membership and for benefits. So, in terms of finance, just for you to know and to consider, we have fundraising strategies addressing individuals, addressing businesses, and sometimes addressing governments. However, when we are talking about government funding an NGO, typically governments fund NGOs when they are asking an NGO to perform a public interest service, so a service in the public interest, and to some extent they are contracting out their services. This is rather common in some countries, particularly in the social and healthcare services, in those services where the human touch or quality of the service is of paramount importance. And in those cases, you really want to make sure that the personnel that is working, for example, with a specific target of patients, really is highly motivated, and you assume that NGO personnel will be more motivated and maybe more customizing than the traditional healthcare service provider. And in this case, you have public sector organizations that act and work as contractor or purchaser, and then you have NGO which produces the service, and the final user or citizens. Okay, so the NGO is producing directly the service, but the public sector operates as a purchaser for that service, which is ultimately delivered to citizens. Naturally, citizens as a collectivity are expected to be also taxpayers, so as such they contribute to all this virtuous cycle, okay? Okay, so let's move to the last part of this lecture, which is about the case of sidelines. I just want to raise a couple of issues, and then we will leave it to the offline discussion. Okay, so the case of sidelines is a case in which we have a non-profit which is performing a service, which is delivering a service which did not exist. So it is a service, particularly assistance to women with high-risk pregnancies. So the service did not exist at all. The healthcare providers and the social services did not provide these services, nor naturally the businesses. Okay, so it was a service brand new. And the founders of the NGO we are considering, again, Sidelines is the name of the NGO, the two founders detected this lack of service, of assistance for women that was experiencing this kind of problems, and decided to deliver the service. First issue. So the first phase of the Sideline story is deciding to deliver a service when there is need, there is proven, evident, empirical societal need, government is not providing the need, business is not providing the service, sorry. So the non-profit was founded. First phase. Since the intrinsic service that the non-profit was providing was typically a distance service, because you didn't expect as founder to have the woman that would move from state to state to provide free assistance to women with high-risk pregnancy. So the very nature of the service was a nature that required distance assistance. And initially, when the non-profit was founded, they used the telephone. So telephone was the main means that was used, the main channel. And in the second phase, when internet started to become an option in the very early phase, so in '97, Sidelines and the founders decided to use internet as a viable alternative. They did it mainly because the cost of telephone bills were too high to be covered by fundraising and voluntary contribution. So they considered the option of internet in the first instance only for reducing costs, but then they realized that internet was indeed a very good alternative to the telephone, and the more internet penetrated in the US households and in their habits, the more internet became #1 channel for ensuring a communication and exchange of opinion and support between women that were willing to volunteer and the women that were experiencing for the first time these kind of problems. And what did they do? And this is rather striking. So they were organized with 30 chapters in the US, so they had 30 state chapters, and at a certain point they created, so they fired the local chapter managers, and they decided to go completely online, creating a citizen relationship management center. So this has been a non-conventional experience in non-profit management, and this is why it is particularly interesting, because in order to ensure the quality of the final services, they were able to quit some personnel, which is rather uncommon in the non-profit world, and this is why it has been a controversial case. Okay? So I would conclude the lecture, I would move to the class discussion, and then to the exam wrap-up. Okay, so first of all, I would like to tell you